Welcome to Sleepy Tales, a place where myths and legends are told slowly and softly to help you gently fall asleep. Before we begin, I'd love for you to share where you're from and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy relaxing stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a night of our peaceful tales. Now settle in, relax, and drift off to tonight's bedtime story. In a world shaped by gods and governed by prophecy, the lives of a condemned princess and a reluctant hero collide beneath the shadow of fate. Perseus and Andromeda, a myth of courage, fate, and love, retells the ancient legend, tracing the journey of a demigod born to defy death and a woman bound by duty, whose strength shines as fiercely as the stars that bear her name. Before the hero, before the monster, before the girl in chains, there was a prophecy. It came quietly, as such things often do, whispered through temple walls and folded into the silence of a king's sleepless night. Acrisius, ruler of Argos, grew old without an heir of strength. His daughter, Danae, was beautiful and silent, a vessel of duty rather than desire. When he sought answers from the oracle at Delphi, her words offered no comfort, only a grim verdict carved in certainty. You shall die by the hand of your daughter's son. Fear corrupted reason. No fortress is strong enough to keep out time, but the king tried anyway. He locked Danae in a bronze chamber deep beneath the palace, an underground prison lit by filtered sunlight and the dull shine of polished metal. There, she could harm no one. There, no man could reach her. But Zeus was not a man. In a shower of gold, formless and divine, he slipped through stone and iron and settled into Danae's world like a breath of fate. No chains could bind a god, and no cage could shield a mortal from destiny. When Danae gave birth, she named the boy Perseus, the destroyer, not out of malice, but out of prophecy's dark humor. Acrisius was not softened by the sight of his grandson. He saw in the infant not hope, but death, and so he cast both mother and child into the sea, sealed in a wooden chest. No storm accompanied their fall. The gods had done enough for now. The sea cradled them, neither merciful nor cruel. After days adrift, the chest touched land on the island of Seriphos. There, a fisherman named Dictys found them and took them in without question. He raised Perseus as his own, quiet and firm, with the sea wind in the boy's lungs and salt water running through his veins. Time passed, and Perseus grew. His strength became evident early, not just in muscle or swiftness, but in something quieter, something ancient. A natural gravity pulled around him, the subtle weight of someone carved by gods rather than born of men. He wrestled waves, climbed sea cliffs with bare hands, and stood still when storms came, as though he belonged more to Olympus than to earth. Danae, ever watchful, warned him of the world's hunger for heroes. Beauty and strength made men curious, but prophecy made them dangerous. Still, Perseus moved with the calm defiance of someone who had not asked to be born of fate and intended to meet it on his own terms. On Seriphos, peace was always conditional. King Polydectes, brother of Dictys and master of the island, grew covetous, not of Perseus, but of Danae. He watched the boy with disdain and the mother with lust, frustrated that neither bent to his will. When his advances were rebuffed, he looked for other means to remove the obstacle. Polydectes summoned the people to a feast, declaring his intention to marry a local noblewoman. Every man was expected to offer a gift. Perseus, who had no wealth to his name, stood empty-handed. It was the moment Polydectes had waited for. With the cunning of a man used to disguising malice as ceremony, he made a grand announcement. Perseus, if he wished to offer something truly worthy, should fetch the head of Medusa, the Gorgon, whose gaze turned men to stone. It was meant as a death sentence masked as honor. But Perseus agreed not with arrogance, but with purpose. In the cold silence of the hall, his voice carried more than courage. It carried inevitability. The gods had not forgotten the boy they birthed in golden rain. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, appeared to him in a dream carved from marble and flame. Hermes followed, wing-footed and ever smiling, and the world changed shape in their presence. They gave him tools, gifts from the divine, a mirrored shield, a blade of celestial metal, winged sandals, and the helm of darkness from Hades himself. They told him where to go, but not what he would become. That he had to find for himself. And so Perseus set out, beyond the edges of maps, toward the sisters who shared one eye between them, and further still into lands where silence had weight and even monsters whispered. Each step carried more than myth. He felt the pull of something distant, unseen but constant. Not a voice, not an omen, but a thread. He could not name it, but in quiet moments between winds, it returned. A shape in the fog, a presence not yet met. In one dream, somewhere beyond the dunes and stars, a name came to him, not spoken, but woven into the rhythm of his breath. Andromeda. It lingered in the corners of his thoughts as he journeyed toward death. He did not know who she was. He did not know if she was real, but the name stayed. Not a promise, not a prophecy, a future. To face a Gorgon was not the same as hunting a beast or slaying a man. It was to step outside the rules of mortal existence and enter a realm shaped by fear itself. Perseus knew this as he approached the desolate lands where nothing grew, where statues of men stood mid-scream, frozen in marble horror. These were not sculptures, they were remains. Medusa was one of three sisters, once beautiful, once mortal. But cursed by Athena, her beauty was replaced with horror. Her hair coiled into serpents, her gaze twisted life into stone, and her presence spread decay wherever she wandered. Her sisters, Stheno and Euryale, were immortal and furious, but it was Medusa who bore the weight of transformation. She alone could be killed. The journey to her lair passed through landscapes untouched by time. Even birds refused to fly above her cave. The land itself held its breath. Yet Perseus pressed forward, sandaled feet grazing the ground without sound, his form half dissolved in shadow under the helm of darkness gifted by Hades. With Hermes's winged sandals, he moved like a wisp of wind, unseen by those who might otherwise stop him. He did not look directly. Athena had warned him in his dream. He carried her shield, polished to reflect with divine clarity, and used it like a mirror to glimpse the world without meeting Medusa's eyes. Step by step, guided by reflection alone, he approached the sleeping monster. She was not still. Even in sleep, Her serpents hissed and writhed, as if echoing the fury of a soul punished too deeply. She was curled like a wounded thing in the corner of the cave, her monstrous form oddly fragile in sleep, her breath low and rhythmic. Perseus, born of gods and shaped by mortal pain, hesitated only once. He did not strike out of hatred. He did not strike for glory. He struck because it had been asked of him, and because a future, still unnamed but sensed, waited beyond her death. His blade fell with divine swiftness. There was no scream, just a sudden stillness, as if the cave exhaled all at once. The severed head, eyes still dangerous, remained awake in a terrible way, its stare potent even in death. He placed it into the satchel Athena had prepared, carefully, with reverence. The sisters awoke with fury ancient and unmatched. Their wails cracked stone, their rage shook the ground, but Perseus did not stay to meet them. Winged sandals lifted him into the air, away from the vengeance of immortals, away from the cave of endings. As he flew, the wind itself seemed altered. The sky had weight. He passed over islands shaped like teeth and through storms that never touched the sea. He no longer moved through the world as a man. With the head of Medusa in his possession, he carried the boundary between life and death. Each night, he slept under stars, unfamiliar to even the oldest sailors. And each night, the same sensation returned. A name whispered not by voice, but by certainty. Andromeda. He did not know what she looked like, or where she was, but she lived in the shape of his thoughts now, as constant as breath. He saw her sometimes in dreams, not clearly, but like a memory from a life he hadn't lived yet. Her presence came not as desire, but as purpose. Perseus descended briefly to land, to rest and gather food, but he never stayed long. The earth no longer held him as tightly as it once had. His path was drawn onward by an invisible pull, something between fate and instinct. He passed over Egypt, where temples rose like ribs from the desert, and over Libya, where the blood that dripped from Medusa's head birthed serpents in the sand. Creation, even in death. The gods left nothing without consequence. One night, over the coast of Phoenicia, he felt a shift in the air. The sea changed color beneath him. The winds no longer wandered, they directed. The divine tools he carried no longer felt like weapons, but keys. As he approached the coast of Ethiopia, a sense of finality crept in, not of the end, but of arrival. The long arc of his journey bent now towards something waiting, something meant. The shoreline stretched in jagged rocks and foam, but it was not the land that caught his eye. It was the figure chained to the cliff, far below where the tide surged and retreated like the breath of a beast. A lone woman stood bound to stone, her form framed by salt and sky. She did not cry out. She did not move. Her stillness was more arresting than any thrashing would have been. He hovered unseen between sky and sea. This was the shape that had haunted his dreams, the outline etched into the corners of his thoughts. She was not a symbol, not a destiny. She was real, and she was in danger. Though he had not spoken her name aloud, though she had not yet seen him, Andromeda had always been with him. He descended. The shore bore witness to injustice long before any hero arrived. Before Perseus hovered above the coast, before the chains were fastened and the sentence delivered, a storm had already been promised. It began not with thunder, but with pride. Cassiopeia, queen of Ethiopia, stood tall among her people and claimed her beauty surpassed that of the Nereids, the sea nymphs, daughters of the sea god Nereus, ancient and radiant in their fury. Such arrogance was not uncommon among mortals, but the ocean rarely forgave an insult. Poseidon's answer was silence at first, then drought, then tides that climbed too high, and storms that came too soon. The people of Ethiopia turned fearful and restless, their prayers unanswered, their fields soaked with brine. The king, Cepheus, sought guidance not from gods, but from oracles, the last voices left when divinity turned away. The answer was cruel and absolute. To atone, the king's daughter must be sacrificed. Only her death could appease the gods of the sea. Andromeda. She did not resist when they took her. She did not scream when her wrists were bound in iron or when her ankles scraped against the cliff's sharp edges. Her calm, to the priests and courtiers, was mistaken for obedience. But it was not submission. It was resolve, quiet and unbearable. They dressed her in ceremonial white, the color of innocence, as though purity could make death more palatable. The city watched in numb reverence, mourning a tragedy they themselves allowed. Her mother turned away. Her father wept in private. The people whispered her name as if it were already myth. But Andromeda was still alive. She stood in solitude, arms stretched behind her, sea spray cold against her skin. Her gaze did not search for salvation. She did not beg for mercy from a sky that had done nothing for her. She only waited for the sea to rise, for the monster to come, for the sentence to be carried out. Perseus saw all of it as he descended, the figure on the cliff, the hush of the waves, the crowd far in the distance, gathered in silence on a bluff high above. The whole kingdom held its breath. Andromeda had never been a dream. She had always existed, waiting in time's quiet margins. As he stepped onto the rocks, the wind shifted. He saw the bruises from the chains and the marks left by the priest's hands. He saw the stubborn tilt of her chin, not proud, but dignified. She did not see him at first. Her eyes were on the horizon, on the water that darkened not with dusk, but with movement. The sea monster was already approaching. Cetus, child of Poseidon's wrath, was older than men remembered. It moved like a mountain, each surge of its body flattening waves beneath it. Its scales caught the dying light, and its mouth yawned wider than a temple gate. The beast had no hunger for flesh. It was hunger itself, made incarnate by divine fury. Andromeda did not tremble. Perseus, still wearing the helm of darkness, was invisible to all, but he felt exposed, not to the crowd or the gods, but to her, the one who had haunted his steps before she had even spoken, the one whose name had found him long before her face had. His descent was not heroic. It was instinct. This was not conquest. This was alignment. He removed the helm, the air shimmering as he stepped into view. Andromeda turned, not with shock, but with recognition. Though they had never met, something ancient passed between them, wordless and immutable. There was no time for more. Cetus rose from the sea, jaws opening with the weight of the tides. The sound was neither roar nor scream, but a drowning, a surge of water and pressure that collapsed the distance between coast and death. Perseus did not hesitate. He launched skyward with Hermes' sandals, soaring over the foam and brine. In one hand he carried the satchel, in the other his blade. But no weapon forged of metal could fell a god's punishment. He had something else, Medusa's head. He waited until the creature's eyes met his, then turned the head to face the monster. Even in death, Medusa's power endured. The gaze that had frozen warriors and shattered empires did not disappoint. Cetus twisted mid-roar, its body halting mid-wave. A great groan rolled across the water as its limbs stiffened mid-surge and then shattered into stone. The beast became reef. The sea went still. The silence that followed was not peace. It was disbelief. The crowd had not seen him descend, but now they saw a man standing on the rocks, wings at his heels, sword at his side, and a woman unchained, her wrists red with rust and deliverance. Andromeda stepped forward, unsteady but upright. She did not rush toward him. She did not fall into his arms. Instead, she simply stood beside him, and that was enough. The bond between them did not ignite in triumph, but in stillness. They looked not at the people cheering from the cliffs or the sea parted by miracle. They looked at each other, not with awe, not with relief, with recognition. In each other, they found what prophecy could not name, not fate, not reward, but a joining, one formed not by chains or curses, but by choice. The chains lay in the surf now, rusted and broken, half buried beneath a tide that no longer reached for blood. The cliffs that once bore witness to a nation's surrender had turned quiet, as though the sea itself had receded in awe. Andromeda stood beneath a sky unfamiliar, not because the stars had changed, but because they had been allowed to shine over her for the first time without judgment. Her body was marked with salt and iron, her wrists bruised from hours of sacrifice, but her spine remained unbent. She was no longer a symbol. She was no longer an offering. She was a person, unchained, unclaimed, unbroken. Perseus stood beside her. The people came slowly down from the cliffs, nobles and priests, servants and soldiers, parents holding children close. They did not speak at first. Their cheers had died on their lips as they approached the two figures standing in the shallows. The man with winged feet, gleaming blade, and the light of Olympus in his presence. The woman they had nearly surrendered to death, now risen beside him. King Cepheus approached first, his robes damp at the hem, his eyes hollow with the weight of choices that could not be undone. He did not meet Andromeda's gaze. He looked to Perseus instead, unsure whether to offer gratitude or apology. Beside him, Cassiopeia remained regal but distant, her pride only cracked, not broken. They offered gold, land, titles. They offered stories to replace the truth. But Andromeda was no longer theirs to decorate, and Perseus was not a hero who required reward. The bond between them had already been made, formed not through ceremony, but through recognition. The decision had already passed quietly between them. She would leave with him. The announcement did not please everyone. There had been an agreement, spoken long before the sacrifice. Andromeda had been promised to Phineus, her uncle, her suitor by blood and tradition. In her father's court, it had always been known that she would marry him, uniting power with continuity. But now she had chosen a stranger, a man who arrived on winds and killed monsters. Phineus did not take the news with silence. He arrived with armed men and rage carefully shaped into righteousness. He claimed theft, not love. He called Perseus a sorcerer, a manipulator, a blasphemer. He called Andromeda disloyal, as if her survival had nullified his claim. The court, caught between shame and fear, watched the confrontation unfold with the cowardice of those who prefer tradition over truth. But Perseus had not come to conquer. He stood unmoved, the weight of Medusa's head still carried in the satchel on his shoulder. When Phineus advanced, drawing steel with trembling fury, Perseus reached slowly, not for his blade, but for the weapon beyond all men. He held up the Gorgon's head. There was no time to flee, no time to reconsider. The moment Phineus looked into her still-living eyes, his face froze mid-curse. Stone crawled across his flesh like frost, locking muscle and memory alike. When it was done, only a statue remained, arms raised, mouth open, fury immortalized. The silence that followed was permanent. No one else dared speak. Perseus lowered the head carefully, restoring it to its covering. The weapon was not one to be displayed in pride, but in sorrow. Every use was a burden, every victim a consequence. He turned not to the crowd but to Andromeda, and she stepped forward without hesitation. They left the city not as victors, but as two people who no longer belonged to it. The people of Ethiopia lined the streets as they passed. Some bowed, some wept, some simply watched in silence, unsure whether they had lost a princess or witnessed her rebirth. As they took flight over the coastline, the city growing smaller beneath them, Perseus held her carefully, but not possessively. There was no conquest in the way he carried her, only reverence. Her arms circled his shoulders, but her gaze remained forward, watching the horizon stretch wider than it ever had before. In the days that followed, they traveled not just through lands, but through each other's silences. Their bond was not filled with declarations or ceremony. It was shaped in the quiet. She taught him to see not only the burden of his lineage, but the grace in restraint. He taught her that freedom could come not only from escape, but from self-definition. They made no vows, none were needed. Their connection was not forged in altars or sanctioned by kings. It had been sealed the moment she stood unshaken on the rocks, and he chose to descend not for glory, but for her. Everything since had only confirmed what had already been made true. They stopped at islands, drank from mountain streams, and slept under unfamiliar constellations. Each night, Perseus still dreamed of monsters, and each morning, Andromeda greeted him with eyes that reminded him what the battle had been for. Her presence did not erase his past, it gave it meaning, and though they spoke little of the future, both knew that it was already forming, quietly, like a constellation not yet named, but already burning. The journey home was not a return, it was a reckoning. Perseus had not forgotten Seriphos, the island of his upbringing, nor the king who ruled it with a smile that masked rot. While he had grown into his myth, Seriphos had decayed in his absence. Polydectes, who had once pretended benevolence, now ruled with open cruelty. Danae, Perseus's mother, no longer walked freely through the village. She was confined to the palace, her refusal to submit branded as defiance, but Perseus had not come back as a boy. He returned with the head of a Gorgon, the favor of gods, and a woman who had faced death and remained unyielding. The island was unprepared. Whispers ran ahead of them, echoing through fishing huts and across stone courtyards. Some remembered the boy who had wrestled tides. Others saw only the man whose shadow moved like a storm. He did not raise his sword. He did not summon fear. He walked through the city like memory made solid, Andromeda at his side, his presence undoing years of pretense with every step. At the palace, the courtiers laughed when he asked for an audience. They did not laugh for long. Before the throne, Polydectes sat arrogant and amused, unaware that fate had arrived. Perseus stood still, unflinching, while accusations spilled from the king's mouth, insults, denials, challenges. He claimed the throne, claimed Danae, claimed Perseus owed him allegiance. But Perseus spoke with action. He uncovered the head of Medusa, and once more the world turned to stone. Polydectes and those loyal to him froze in place, their final expressions carved into eternity, mouths half open, fingers curled mid-command. The very pillars of the palace seemed to recoil, stone recognizing stone. In an instant, the rule of a tyrant ended, not with a battle, but with a gaze. Danae was freed. She did not cry. She only stepped forward and placed her hand on her son's face, as if to confirm what time had already proven, that he had not been broken by fate, only sharpened by it. Perseus returned the divine artifacts, the sandals, the sword, the helm, to the gods. He did not hoard gifts not meant for mortals. He kept only the shield and the memory of Medusa's head, now buried far from reach. Her power had served its purpose, but it was not a legacy he wished to preserve. He had another to build. Andromeda, no longer bound to coastline or court, now stood beside Perseus, not as a rescued bride, but as a queen forged by choice. Her time on Seriphos was quiet but powerful. She moved through the island with a grace that disarmed and a gaze that unsettled. Many recognized her strength, but did not understand it. She had no desire to rule, but her presence alone redefined what rule meant. Together, they left Seriphos, not long after peace was restored. The island had given Perseus a beginning. It could not contain his ending. They returned to Argos, where the prophecy still waited. Acrisius, the grandfather who had cast them to sea, had long abandoned any hope of peace. Upon hearing of Perseus's return, he fled the city, as if distance might delay destiny. But fate is not a predator. It does not chase, it waits. At a funeral games held in Larissa, Perseus, unaware of his grandfather's presence among the crowd, entered a competition. When he threw the discus, it veered off course in the wind, a sudden shift, small and unplanned. The disc struck an old man in the audience, killing him instantly. Acrisius. The prophecy had fulfilled itself, not through vengeance but accident, not by hatred but inevitability. Perseus mourned the man he had never known, not as family, but as another piece of the machinery that had shaped his life. The death was not a triumph, it was a weight, the final link in the chain that had bound his story to shadow. After that, Perseus no longer wandered. He and Andromeda settled in Tiryns, a quiet stronghold of stone and olive trees. There they built a life free of omens. They raised children, taught peace, and wove their days not with conquest, but with calm. Their home became a place of reflection, where heroes visited not for glory, but for truth. They ruled with stillness. They ruled together. Time did not erase their past. It softened it. In old age, their names passed into myth, reshaped by poets and priests. Their story was retold in temples and carved into stone walls, sometimes with accuracy, more often with exaggeration. But the truth lived where no myth could touch it, in the space between their glances, in the silent comfort of knowing and being known. When their bodies faded, the gods did not forget them. Athena placed them in the sky, not as punishment or reward, but as recognition. Andromeda rose first, her constellation chained not by the cosmos, but as remembrance, so that no girl would ever be forgotten for her silence. Perseus followed, his stars shaped not into a weapon, but a shield held outward. Beside him, the remnants of their journey, Pegasus, born of Medusa's death, Cetus turned to constellation in defeat. They became more than story. They became sky, eternal, unblinking, and always just above the horizon, watching, waiting, reminding.